Partway through the holiday, we took a trip east along what are now thankfully tarmacked roads for a 2-night stay upriver at Tendaba. Open country beckoned as we left the bustling suburbs of Banjul and Brikama. We made a few stops along the route, initially at a roadside section of Bama Kuno Forest Park. Exploring a few of the main tracks, we located this skulking bearded barbet. A large mahogany tree was productive. Firstly, we detected a pair of African green pigeons. And then a Bruce's green pigeon with its distinctive yellow belly. The small village of Bullock, a few miles east, has a series of rice fields along the course of a river and warranted another stop. Here we saw a distant preening male black-winged bishop, a dark chanting goshawk perched on roadside pylons, and overhead a tawny eagle. And an increasingly rare sight in the Gambia, an immature Egyptian vulture being harassed by a pied crow. The next stop was at Kampanti, a site renowned for soaring raptors. We saw a good selection, but only this African harrier hawk was filmable. A few woolly-necked storks were also overhead. In the adjacent scrub there was a yellow-breasted apallis. And a calling yellow-fronted tinkerbird. Closer to Tendaba, a perched grasshopper buzzard was deserving of another stop. Another soared overhead. We arrived at Tendaba mid-afternoon and settled into our not-so-luxurious accommodation at Tendaba Camp. Given the location, this really could be so much better. We arrived in time for an afternoon boat trip, and after a few logistical problems, set off across the Gambia River. On the way, a hammerkop flew alongside us. Our destination was the mangrove-lined creeks on the north side of the river. One of the commonest species along the riverbanks was African darter. And there were lots of great white egrets, fewer grey herons, and only a couple of squacco herons. Plus a few ospreys. Kingfishers included malachites and blue-breasted, regularly seen but very wary. From a flock of white-throated bee-eaters, only one perched in reasonable view, and a mangrove sunbird showed briefly. As we cruised further up the creek, we passed a huge colony of white-breasted cormorants, treated by various authorities as either a distinctive race of the widespread great cormorant or as a species in its own right, restricted to sub-Saharan Africa. Adults have black bellies, whereas younger birds have all white or mottled underparts. Some though, as in the middle of this group, had black heads and necks, and their provenance was unclear. As the light faded and the tide ebbed, we made our way back to the main river, passing a few pink-backed pelicans on the way. Back at the landing stage, house swifts had returned to their nests at dusk. Early the next morning, the swifts had already departed for the day, and their place taken by the local wire-tailed swallows. After breakfast, we were back across the river and exploring the creeks again. African darters were again abundant, often dropping into the water as we approached. An immature was struggling with a recently caught fish. It had speared it towards the tail, which was proving rather awkward to manage. There were pink-backed pelicans again, and the cormorant colony seemed a little less busy at this time of day. But thankfully, the blue-breasted kingfishers were showing better than they had the previous day. There were also pied kingfishers. And sitting next to one of these, we came across this grey-headed kingfisher, a species not normally associated with riverine habitats. The tide was rising, so today we were able to go deeper into the mangroves. Our quarry being a pair of white-backed night herons. One was hidden sitting on a nest, but the other perched very considerately, bearing in mind how shy this nocturnal species can be. The creeks aren't just lined with mangroves, there are also more open environments. Here we saw grey herons, woolly-necked storks. This African form is now sometimes split from those found in Asia, as they have differences in head coloration. An intermediate egret, western reef herons, a whimbrel, white-throated bee-eaters, and a single blue-cheeked bee-eater. In some places the creeks open out to reveal expanses of grassland. A flock of great white pelicans flew past in the distance, and a female Montague's harrier eventually provided reasonable views. More woolly-necked storks foraged in the marshier areas, and a pair of yellow-billed storks allowed a welcome close approach. Mid-morning we headed back to Tendaba. Once back at the camp, we walked inland to where a small pool has been created to attract local birds. Northern grey-headed sparrows shared the facilities with an assortment of weavers and finches. These included a male yellow-fronted canary and a variety of astrildid finches with red-cheeked cordon bleus, lavender waxbills and black-rumped waxbills, the latter with distinctive red bills and eye stripes. Lesser blue-eared starlings were also here, but rather more wary. They are similar to other glossy starlings, but with a more defined ear-covert patch and uniform rump and upper parts. The surrounding light woodland was the only place on the trip that we saw bush petronia. There was also a striped kingfisher and a rather more showy Abyssinian roller. In the afternoon we drove southeast to a bush track around the small village of Batelling, on the outskirts of the West Kayang National Park. Around the houses, a red-rumped swallow was collecting nesting material, and a small flock of yellow-billed oxpeckers appeared, attracted by the presence of the village's cattle. This was also a good area for namakwa dove. In nearby fields we found a small flock of black-headed lapwings. They're fairly common, but often crepuscular in habits, so can be hard to see. A male vitelline masked weaver showed well, identified by its black mask and red eyes. We also had good views of a calling juvenile dark chanting goshawk. Similar at this age to gaybar goshawks, but a bigger bird, and with barring generally extending onto the undertail coverts. And a preening African grey hornbill. A male pygmy sunbird was a welcome discovery along one of the tracks. Its tail streamers were longer than its body. A female was perched nearby, and soon attracted the attention of the male. We stayed on until dusk approached, and came across a superb pair of four-banded sand grouse. Their name comes from the pairs of bands across the male's breast and forehead. The female is more cryptically camouflaged and lacks the male's banding. As they wandered off into the bush, we also found a clandestine spotted thickney. And as darkness descended, we spotlighted a male long-tailed nightjar on the track. On our return journey, we stopped off again at Campanti. At the small roadside marsh here was an African jacana, soon found to be chaperoning 4 chicks. Amongst the cattle egrets was a lone black-headed heron. Apart from the black on the head, black on the neck also distinguishes them from the similar-sized grey heron. On overhead wires were more Abyssinian rollers. An adult battler passed over, a speciality here. And amongst the vultures was an adult Eurasian griffon. Soaring above us, a young African harrier hawk, looking very eagle-like at this age, but with a very distinctive underwing pattern, which can, though, be hard to see. Adults are more distinctive, plus a much rarer, but more easily identified, adult African hawk eagle. From here it wasn't long before we were back into the busy coastal towns and on to our base at Farakunku.